all the people buried here in historic Hollywood Cemetery, including presidents, generals, and statesmen, few have had the impact of Dr. Walter Plecker. His stormy legacy continues today.
My parents always made sure that we knew the story about what Walter Plecker had done and how it had affected our people.
Plecker was a menace to Virginia Indians over many years.
Well, Dr. Plecker was convinced that there was a need to purify the white race. He thought that he was preserving the Commonwealth of Virginia, that he was maintaining the United States of America, and most importantly to him, that he was protecting the white race.
For 34 years, starting in 1912, Dr. Plecker was the director of the state's Bureau of Vital Statistics, carefully compiling birth and death records. Anyone who had one drop of other than white blood was listed as colored. They were mongrels, in his view. Plecker was relentless. With great energy, he compiled lists and wrote letters chastising whites who applied for marriage licenses with those Plecker thought were impure.
There's no question that Plecker was incredibly aggressive about using the few prerogatives the law gave him to register people. He used those prerogatives really to threaten people, to coerce them. Dr. Plecker once boasted that he had a list of people by race that rivaled that list that was kept by Hitler of the Jews.
Virginia Indians particularly felt his wrath. Quote, like rats when you're not watching, he wrote, they've been sneaking in their birth certificates through their own midwives.
You know, we couldn't claim we were Indian. It was against the law to say we were Indian. What do we claim? You know, we're not black and we're not white.
That whole idea that you are not what you believe yourself to be.
Whole groups of people who formerly were recognized among the tribes of Virginia simply disappeared from the records. They were no longer considered to be Native Americans or Indians as they were called. Their children were not recognized as members of the tribes, and they're living with that legacy right now.
Plecker and his many supporters believed not only that races should never intermarry, they shouldn't even mingle. Strict segregation would last for generations. Blacks had to have their own schools and neighborhoods. So did Indians.
This was the schoolhouse, and for a long time, up until 1908, the church.
We blame Plecker, but he gave it to a very hungry audience. They ate it up.
Indeed, Plecker was seen as a heroic figure in an era when genetic engineering was becoming mainstream. The eugenics movement was white supremacy cloaked in science. Its supporters were many and influential, from leading academics at University of Virginia to wealthy industrialists.
We have to remember that in the 1920s, most people lived on farms. So people knew about livestock, they knew about growing corn, they knew about culling the herd and getting rid of the ones that weren't any good and keeping the ones that were the most sound. And so these ideas of animal husbandry were useful to people making biological arguments about society.
There was a lot of cross-pollination between Virginia's movement and Adolf Hitler's quest for a master race. The Richmond Times-Dispatch editorialized in 1924 that racial intermingling would ruin the white man. Quote, once a drop of inferior blood gets in his veins, he descends lower and lower in the mongrel scale. That was the year the General Assembly passed the Racial Integrity Act, narrowly defining race and making it illegal for whites to marry anyone of any other race. Plecker wrote to the governors of the rest of the states, urging them to pass similar laws to save the white race.
We have a law.
There's a sterilization law that's passed in Virginia, upheld later in the United States Supreme Court, allowing some 60,000 plus people to be sterilized in institutions, 32 states all over the country.
Well, we're trying to help them, Alice, and you too. Have your entire family sterilized.
The Racial Integrity Act, which Plecker pushed, stood until 1967, when the appropriately named Loving case about an interracial couple led to a U.S. Supreme Court reversal. But the damage to Virginia's Indian tribes continues. There are more than 560 federally recognized Indian tribes in the country, but none of Virginia's tribes, the ones that helped the settlers survive, have that crucial recognition, because Walter Plecker did everything he could to destroy evidence of their existence.
I don't know that you can ever atone for the bad things that have been done, and we are people who believe in forgiveness, and humanity and brotherhood. And so let's make today a new day.
In less than a century, what Dr. Plecker feared the most has come to pass.
I'm sure that Dr. Plecker would be shocked to walk through a city like Washington, D.C., or for that matter, downtown Richmond, and see that there were people of different races walking hand in hand. It wasn't the world that he looked forward to. He really looked forward to a very different, much more restricted world.